Over to Esther right away.
Thank you, Frank. Good morning, colleagues, friends. I'm pretty rotten chair already because we're already 15 minutes late, so I hope to try and make up some of that time and to apologise to everybody who did arrive on time. My first job was as a waitress, and there's one thing I know, that hungry people get very angry. So I promise I will get you out of here at 1 o'clock, which is the agreed finish time. We have three exciting, interesting presentations this morning. Our first one is from Terence McDonough, or Terry, from the Department of Economics at NUI Galway. Terry is an author, the most recent book being Contemporary Capitalism and Its Crisis, Social Structure of Accumulation Theory. Terry has also been very supportive to the Irish trade union movement, being a key contributor to the HEAP chart, which is, to get it right, the hierarchy of earnings, attributions of privilege, what's it, chart, yeah? But really what that chart was it was a visual depiction of where people stand in terms of how much money they have, and when you actually see that on the chart, you realise that the vast majority of people are really just, working very hard just to make a living. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Terence and ask him to make his presentation.
Well, apologies for the PowerPoint. In some cases, it's really much more effective to just speak, but we've gotten used to this in the academic world, and students really are nervous if they don't see PowerPoint behind the lecturer, because they'll know they'll have to take much more detailed notes. PowerPoint they can usually access on the internet afterwards. What I usually speak about in this context is the causes of the crisis, and the point that I like to make in that context is that what we're facing is not just a financial crisis, but is much deeper and simultaneously much broader than that. What we're actually looking at is a crisis of global neoliberalism. And I won't get into much detail, if any, on that today, except perhaps in response to questions afterwards. What I want to talk about this morning for you all is the popular response to the crisis, rather than the crisis itself, and the questions of sovereignty, more particularly national sovereignty, which are raised in the context of trying to formulate a popular response to the crisis. But what I will say is that we're facing three related crises. First, a crisis of global neoliberalism. People are generally aware that the trigger for the crisis started in the United States and then spread pretty much like wildfire across the capitalist world. Secondly, we're looking at a Eurozone crisis. A Eurozone crisis really of such immediacy and severity that the other crisis, the global crisis, is pretty much dropped from consideration here within the boundaries of Europe. And to a certain extent, the Irish crisis. This is a kind of Banksy-style illustration which I found on the internet. I don't know where this is. It's somewhere in Dublin if it hasn't been painted over already. And I don't know who did it, but I like it. The Irish crisis, which is, again, a specific crisis. These crises are, in fact, nested within one another. You have the global crisis, and then within that, the European crisis, though it has its own particular characteristics. And then within the European crisis and the global crisis, you have the Irish crisis. What I want to talk about is specifically a socialist response to the crisis, as the title of this morning's seminar is An Economics for the Common Good. And I want to look at it in the context of the range of demands which a socialist political perspective, whether it's a socialist Republican or socialist feminist or socialist unmodified kind of perspective. There's the demand for socialism, which is, I think, always current. Then there are the demands of the socialists for things like human rights and various freedoms of assembly and things like that. Again, these are always current. Then there are popular demands, which the socialists can support, and the crisis has thrown up any number of these and will throw up more in the future. The most recent, of course, has been the whole question of the household charge and the septic tank charge, and perhaps even more recent than that, the demand for the restoration of the various carers payments, which the government was forced to give in on. And then finally there are transitional demands, and this is what I want to concentrate on this morning. Transitional demands are those which, if achieved, will strengthen the working class, which can be widely supported, but which capitalism cannot grant, and the struggle for which will educate the public. I suppose the demand for full employment is a very good example of a demand which meets all of these criteria. Full employment would strengthen the working class. It's a popular demand which capitalism ultimately cannot grant, and the struggle for which would be extraordinarily educational if we could move this demand forward. But that's not the demand I want to talk about this morning. I want to talk about two different programs by way of asking the question, at which of the levels should the crisis be addressed? That is, the global level, the European level, or the national level. If we were to try and set about developing a program at the European level, I'm going to argue that it would have a number of elements. And to leave time for questions at the end, and what I think is really perhaps going to be part of a very essential discussion over the coming months and perhaps years, I'm not going to go into too much detail on any one of these program points, partly because I'm going to give you a whole nother list when we come to the national level. First, debt should be financed by Eurobonds. I think this could potentially be a popular demand. It's absolutely irrational that different countries should be paying wildly different interest rates on debt, especially as the deeper the trouble you're in, the harder it becomes to borrow the money to get yourself out of trouble. This is completely irrational. A solidaristic response would be for the stronger economies to support the weaker, and one way of doing this would, on a technical level, really would be the issuance of Eurobonds rather than national debt. Secondly, and there have been a medium sort of step within the last week in this direction. This has been really a concession to the critics of the neoliberal organization of the European Central Bank. They've made this concession without actually admitting that it goes against some of the fundamental principles upon which the European Bank was set up. The European Central Bank should be willing to buy these Eurobonds in order to finance deficits and to control interest rates. This is what European central banks do across the world. This is actually not a particularly radical demand in any context except Europe. 3, a portion of the Irish sovereign debt, although this would also apply certainly to Greece and Portugal, Spain, and probably Italy. A portion of the Irish sovereign debt should be written down or paid off by the European Central Bank. In some senses, this is really the same proposal. That is, a lot of the debt is now owed to the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank has the power to print money. They can print money and pay themselves off. They should, simply because the Irish national debt is now unsustainable. You can't pay 6% on 120% of GDP when growth is about 0%. The figures just simply don't add up. It's simple mathematics. Fourth, the EU needs a tax-financed budget to transfer expenditure to underperforming regions while shifting the tax burden to the wealthy. 5, the private banking sector has proven itself to be a failure and incompetent at running what is essentially a public utility. That is, the structure and mechanism by which the money lubricates the various economic transactions which we all and businesses make every day. We've left that largely in private hands. They've messed it up. We should admit that they messed it up and take it back into public control. And then 6, and this is a bit of a technical point, but I think it's important. The trade deficits, for instance, the trade deficit that Greece has, this is something that doesn't actually affect Ireland all that much, since we don't have a trade deficit. We're not importing more than we're exporting, but the Greeks are. The flip side of that is simply that the Germans are exporting more than they're importing. And it's not possible to solve the Greek problem, that is, a negative trade deficit, without solving what is essentially a German problem, which is a positive trade surplus. The argument is that the Greeks should take a big cut in their wages and their standard of living in order to be more competitive, import less, and export more. Wouldn't it make more sense for the Germans to take a big increase in their wages, become a bit less competitive, import more, including from places like Greece, and export a bit less to places like Greece in order to help the indigenous industry and economy of Greece to recover? Is that painful? In fact, it's not. Well, perhaps it would be painful to German industrialists, but it certainly wouldn't be painful to the German working class. That's a program which I think constitutes a radical program, short of socialism, on the European level, which involves a break with neoliberal ideology and an overcoming of the democratic deficit. Suppose, rather, we decided to address the problem on an Irish level, rather than a European level. What would we demand in a specifically national Irish context? First is a default on the debt, something a sovereign nation is capable of doing. This is not something which is attractive. That is, in ordinary times, you don't just willy-nilly default on international debts. This, however, is not an ordinary time. Again, the Irish national debt is unpayable. It will be defaulted on sooner or later. The best policy, when faced with the prospect of a default, is to default early and not often. They've been pushing Greece to do the exact opposite of the way it should be done. Hold off, hold off, hold off, default a little, hold off, hold off, hold off, default a little more.